You wouldn't think an old man like me would have his world turned upside down at his granddaughter's wedding. But life has a funny way of teaching you lessons just when you think you've learned them all. It all started on a brisk April evening in Cleveland. I was sitting in my favorite recliner, reading the paper, when my daughter Rachel barged into the room, cheeks rosy from the wind, eyes shining in that way only good news can do. "Dad, I'm getting married. Brandon proposed." She could hardly contain herself as she flashed her hand, a delicate ring sparkling under my old lamp. My newspaper slid to the floor as I stood to hug her, my heart feeling years younger for just a moment. "When did this happen?" I asked, not quite believing the news. "Just tonight. He took me out to Lakeview Park, down by the old pier," she said, voice trembling with joy. "Got down on one knee and everything. I thought I'd faint." Her laughter filled the room, and for a second I saw the little girl who used to bring me rocks and dandelions from the backyard. "Show me a photo of this lucky fellow." I grinned, settling back as she scrolled her phone and handed it to me. On the screen, Brandon Miles looked every inch the all-American boy, neat hair, broad smile, the kind of jaw that photographs well. But the last name made my stomach tighten. Miles. That was a name I'd crossed paths with before, back when I was running my manufacturing business in Ohio. The Miles family had a reputation, and it wasn't for community service. I tried to keep my voice even. "Rachel, are you sure? About Brandon and his family?" Her face fell, confusion creasing her brow. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, memories of the Miles boardroom betrayals and whispered scandals rushing back. "Let's just say the Miles family has had their share of headlines around here. Not all of them good." Rachel's face closed up like a storm front. "You don't know him, Dad. Brandon's not like that. He chose me, not those country club girls his mother parades in front of him." I reached for her, but she stepped back, voice shaky but loud. "Why can't you just be happy for me?" I heard the hurt in her words, sharper than anything a business rival had ever thrown at me. But I couldn't help but worry. Rachel always believed the best in people, and sometimes that kindness got her hurt. "Rachel, I just want you to be safe. People like the Miles." But she cut me off, her words coming fast and hard. "I came here because I wanted my father to be happy for me. I should have known better." She snatched her purse and stormed out, leaving only the echo of her anger and the slam of the door behind her. I stood there for a long time, holding on to silence where her joy had just been. It's a strange thing, raising a daughter. You spend decades protecting them, only to realize one day that you can't. Not really. Not from heartbreak, or disappointment, or even their own choices. I picked up an old photo of my late wife, Ellen, from the mantel. Her smile looked back at me, patient as ever. "What would you do, Ellen?" I asked the picture, already knowing the answer. She would have invited Brandon over for dinner. She would have watched, listened, and trusted Rachel to figure it out herself. I wish I could say I found comfort in that thought. But I didn't sleep much that night, or the next. My house felt colder, bigger, more empty without Rachel's evening phone calls. All I had was the slow tick of the clock and a crossword puzzle I couldn't finish. A week passed before I picked up the phone. My apology felt clumsy, but it was honest. "Rachel, I'm sorry for how I reacted. You deserve to be celebrated." Her voice on the other end was cautious, but hopeful. We agreed on dinner. Rachel and Brandon would come over on Saturday, and I'd cook Ellen's old pot roast recipe. There was just one condition I asked. "Don't tell Brandon anything about my business days. Let him meet me as just your old man." She laughed, relieved. "Sure, Dad. He'll love you, you'll see." Saturday rolled around. I traded my suit and cufflinks for faded jeans and a flannel shirt. I even dusted off the old Chevy, making sure there was no hint of my past life as a CEO. Tonight wasn't about money or status. It was about meeting the man my daughter loved. And if Brandon Miles was half the man Rachel claimed, he wouldn't care if I was rich or poor. That night, as I set the dinner table, I glanced at Ellen's photo and smiled. Here goes nothing, sweetheart. The next chapter of our family's story was about to begin, and I was determined to let Rachel write it, mistakes, surprises, and all. Saturday evening arrived, bringing with it a steady drizzle that tapped out a nervous rhythm on my kitchen window. The house smelled like pot roast, onions, and the faintest hint of Ellen's lavender air freshener. I fussed with the table for the third time, straightening napkins, polishing the old salt and pepper shakers, anything to keep my mind from wandering down anxious roads. At exactly 6 o'clock, Rachel's old Corolla rolled into the driveway, headlights dancing in the puddles. She stepped out first, umbrella in hand, face bright and hopeful. Brandon followed, tall and confident, the kind of man who looks like he's always expecting good news. He wore a navy blazer over a check shirt, but even in the cheap porch light, I could see the watch glinting on his wrist. The Miles never did anything halfway. I opened the door before they knocked. "Evening, kids! Come on in before you drown out there." Rachel grinned, and Brandon shook my hand, firm but polite. "Mr. Walker, thank you for having me." "Call me Frank," I replied, waving them inside. "Shoes off, Ellen's rule." We sat around the old dining table. I served pot roast, and Rachel poured iced tea, her smile relaxed now that she was home. Brandon complimented the food, the house, even the dog-eared family photos in the hallway. For the first half hour, everything felt normal, maybe even better than normal. But as dinner went on, Brandon's conversation took a turn. He talked about his family's business in Cincinnati, dropping hints about private clubs and European vacations. When Rachel mentioned teaching at the local elementary school, Brandon laughed. "You're a saint, Ratch. But after we get married, you won't have to work unless you want to. My parents want us to look at condos near downtown, views of the river, lots of amenities." Rachel blushed, glancing at me. "I liked my job, Brandon. And we talked about starting out small, remember?" Brandon smiled, but I caught the quick flash of annoyance in his eyes. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll figure it out." I sipped my tea, keeping my thoughts to myself. Ellen's words echoed in my mind. "Watch how a man treats people he thinks can help him." I watched, all right. After dinner, we moved to the living room for coffee. Brandon checked his phone a little too often. When he talked, his eyes flickered to the corners of the room, assessing. I noticed how he lingered on the price tag of everything. "Nice recliner, Frank." "My dad has something similar. He swears by leather, says it's an investment." I shrugged. "This one's from Sears, bought on clearance when Rachel was in high school. Still works just fine." He smiled, but there was a slight twitch in his jaw. I could almost see the mental math. Rachel's dad is no threat. Rachel, eager to smooth things over, asked about wedding plans. Brandon lit up, eager to talk venues and guest lists, always with an eye on appearances. "My folks are hoping for the Grandview Country Club. Plenty of space, top-notch food. We can invite everyone who's anyone." My girl hesitated. "That's a lot, Brandon. I was thinking something smaller, maybe just family and close friends." Brandon squeezed her hand. "Let's not worry about money, babe. My parents want to take care of everything." I watched Rachel shrink into herself just a bit, and my chest tightened. I thought about all the hours Ellen and I had spent around this table teaching Rachel to value kindness over money, effort over luxury. The evening wound down. Brandon offered to help clear the dishes, but only after Rachel started. When he thought I wasn't looking, he scrolled his phone, grinning at a text. Rachel hugged me at the door, whispering, "Thank you, Dad. It means everything that you tried." I squeezed her hand, wanting to tell her everything I was feeling, but I bit my tongue. "You're my girl. I'll always try." Brandon shook my hand on his way out, still polite, but distant now that the performance was over. I watched them drive away, Rachel's taillights blinking through the drizzle, my heart heavy as old stone. I locked up, poured myself a nightcap, and sat alone with Ellen's photo. Not sure about this one, Elle, I whispered to her, smile. He's charming, I'll give him that. But is he good? The house settled around me, silent but for the hum of the fridge. I thought about the wedding Brandon had described. Big, flashy, all Miles' family money and prestige. Was Rachel headed for happiness, or just another life lived for someone else's approval? I drifted off in my chair, Ellen's picture still in my hand. My dreams were uneasy, visions of Rachel, lost in a sea of strangers, reaching for me but never quite able to find her way home. The weeks that followed blurred into a mix of wedding talk and uneasy silence. Rachel called often, her voice bouncing between excitement and something I recognized all too well, doubt. I tried to play the supportive father, but I caught the cracks in her laughter, the pauses after Brandon's name, the way she always changed the subject if I asked too many questions. It was late May when the Miles family invited me to their place for a formal dinner. Just a little get-together, Rachel promised, but when I pulled up to their enormous house overlooking the Ohio River, I knew this was more than pot roast and sweet tea. Their driveway was longer than my whole street. A hired valet took my old Chevy's keys and tried not to wrinkle his nose. Inside, the house was all glass and granite, artwork on every wall, floors that echoed under my shoes. Brandon's mother, Linda, greeted me with a practiced smile, her diamond bracelet catching the chandelier light. "Frank, we're so pleased to finally meet Rachel's father." She pronounced it pleased like it cost her something. Brandon's father, Charles, shook my hand with the grip of a man who'd spent his life closing deals. "We've heard so much about you," he said, though his eyes gave away nothing. Brandon hovered nearby, clearly at ease in his element, showing off Rachel as if she were the newest addition to his portfolio. Dinner was served by uniformed staff. Every plate was arranged like a magazine photo shoot. Conversation circled around golf clubs, investment returns, and vacation homes in Hilton Head. Every so often, Linda would toss a question my way. "Where did you grow up, Frank? What was your line of work?" I kept my answers plain. "Worked in local manufacturing. Ran a shop for years. Nothing fancy, but it paid the bills." I saw Charles glance at Brandon, the unspoken message: Rachel comes from simple people. Rachel, bless her, tried to bring me in, but each effort was steered back to the Miles family's achievements. Brandon slipped easily into his role, talking about future plans, hinting that he'd be joining his father's business full-time after the wedding. "We're expanding into Columbus, Dad. I'll be overseeing the new property development, should double our net worth in 2 years." He said it with the assurance of someone who never worried about a mortgage payment. Rachel tried to speak up. "Brandon, what about teaching? I thought you liked working with the after-school program." He smiled at her, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's fine for now, but honey, you know once we're married, we'll have responsibilities. Real ones. Dad's counting on me." Rachel nodded, shrinking back a bit, picking at her food. As dessert arrived, Linda leaned across the table, smiling too widely. "Rachel, dear, we've made arrangements for the wedding at Riverbend Country Club. The ballroom is exquisite. You'll love it. Of course, we'll handle all the details. You won't have to lift a finger." Rachel glanced at me, then at Brandon, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought Dad and I could help pick the flowers. Mom always loved lilies in spring." Linda patted her hand, her own ring sparkling. "Sweetheart, these planners handle everything. It's best to let professionals do their work." "Don't worry, you'll have the wedding of the year." Brandon nodded, raising his wine glass. "To new beginnings, right, Dad?" Charles joined in, and everyone toasted, except me and Rachel. I sat quietly, watching my daughter's dreams of a simple wedding slip further out of reach. I remembered the way Ellen would laugh at fancy banquets, always more comfortable at backyard barbecues than ballrooms. If she were here, she'd know what to say, she always did. After dinner, Brandon pulled me aside while Rachel and his mother disappeared to look at invitations. He leaned against the marble countertop, confidence oozing from every pore. Listen, Frank, I want you to know how much Rachel means to me. She's lucky to have a father who raised her right. I just hope you understand that things are different now. There are expectations, especially with my family's reputation. I looked him straight in the eye, not flinching. All I expect is for Rachel to be loved and respected, Brandon. Everything else is window dressing. He nodded, but I could tell my words rolled right off him. Of course. But you know, sometimes a man has to think bigger. Rachel's always had big dreams, right? My family can give her things you never could. He smiled like he'd given me a compliment. That's the thing about dreams, Brandon, I replied. They don't always come wrapped in dollar signs. We stared at each other for a moment, either of us blinking. In that instant, I saw the real Brandon, proud, entitled, absolutely certain that money was the answer to everything. My heart ached for Rachel, caught in the middle of a world she never wanted. On the drive home, headlights slicing through the dark, I replayed the night over and over. The Miles family made it clear Rachel was marrying into money, and I was expected to smile and say thank you. But what would happen to her once the party ended, and the real life began? I drove past the old park where Rachel learned to ride her bike, the school where Ellen volunteered for every bake sale. All the small, ordinary things that made a life, things no one at that dinner table could buy. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen, the clock ticking loud in the stillness. I opened Ellen's recipe box, running my fingers over her faded handwriting. How do I keep her safe, Ellen? I whispered. But the only answer was the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and the deep ache of a father who knew he was running out of time. Summer in Ohio means humidity that settles in your bones and long evenings where the sky never seems to get dark enough. The days crawled by, filled with wedding emails and calls from Rachel, each one sounding a little less like my daughter and a little more like someone rehearsing lines in a play she didn't want to star in. Rachel was stretched thin, torn between her dreams and the Miles family machine. Every call from her ended with, "I have to go, Dad. Linda wants my opinion on table runners," or "Brandon's mom is setting up a call with the decorator, but I wanted daisies, not orchids." Each little detail, flowers, guest lists, even the menu, seemed to slip out of her hands and into someone else's. One Saturday, Rachel showed up at my house unexpectedly. Her hair was in a messy ponytail, and I could tell she'd been crying, though she tried to hide it behind a tired smile. "Dad, can I come in for a bit?" "Always," I said, opening the door wide and giving her a long hug she didn't resist. We sat on the porch, the old swing creaking beneath us. For a while, she didn't say anything. Just watched the fireflies blink over the yard Ellen had loved to garden. Finally, Rachel sighed. "It's not really my wedding anymore, Dad. It's the Miles show. They've picked the band, the food, the colors. I don't even recognize myself in the plans." I squeezed her hand. "You're still my girl, Ratch. You don't need a big wedding to prove anything." She smiled weakly. "I know. I thought it would feel different." I searched her eyes, wanting to say something that would make it better, but all I could offer was the truth. Marriage isn't about the party. It's about what happens after everyone goes home. Rachel leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in months, it felt like I had my daughter back, even if only for a moment. The next week brought another invitation, this time to the Miles pre-wedding cocktail party. I nearly turned it down, but Rachel called and begged. "Please, Dad. Just be there for me." I put on my best shirt, the one Ellen always said made my eyes look less tired, and drove across town to the Miles' sprawling house. The driveway was jammed with cars I'd only ever seen in magazines. Inside, the house buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses. Waiters in black ties moved through the crowd with trays of appetizers so tiny you need 10 of them just to feel full. Brandon's father, Charles, found me near the fireplace. He handed me a drink I didn't want, but I took it anyway. "Frank, glad you could make it. These events can be overwhelming, but you get used to them. After all, family is about putting on a good show." I nodded politely. I always figured family was about showing up when it counts, not showing off. He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, in our world, perception is everything. I hope you're not uncomfortable." "Been through worse," I replied, thinking of long nights fixing the assembly line at my old shop, the times Ellen was sick and I had to be both mom and dad. Rachel was standing near the piano with Linda, who was animatedly discussing the importance of the perfect wedding hashtag. I caught Rachel's eye, and she gave me a little smile that said, "Thank you for being here." That alone made the evening bearable. Later, as I stood awkwardly by the window, Brandon approached with 2 of his friends in tow. All 3 wore the same uniform: tailored blazers, expensive watches, smiles just a bit too wide. "Frank, this is Carter and Drew. They both went to Princeton with me. Carter's dad owns half the buildings on 5th Street, and Drew's family just bought a place in Aspen." I shook their hands. They nodded politely but made it clear I wasn't part of the inner circle. Brandon turned to them. "You know, Rachel's dad is the hardest working man I know. Built his life from scratch. Can you believe he still drives an old Chevy?" Carter grinned. "Hey, vintage is cool now. You could get big money for it if you played it right." Brandon winked at me. "Nah, Frank's the real deal. Doesn't care about money. That's why I like him." The whole thing felt like a performance. I laughed along, but inside it stung. I wondered if Brandon even realized how patronizing he sounded, or if it was just second nature. As the party wound down, I found Rachel in the kitchen, sneaking a moment away from the crowd. "You doing okay, kiddo?" She nodded, but her eyes were tired. "I just want it to be over, Dad. The party, the planning, all of it. I just want to be married and find out if I can be happy with Brandon away from all this noise." I hugged her, wishing I could tell her for sure that happiness was waiting. But I'd learned a long time ago, happiness isn't something you can guarantee for your kids, no matter how hard you try. As I drove home that night, rain streaked across the windshield, blurring the city lights. My mind turned over everything I'd seen and heard. The Miles family didn't see me as Rachel's father, they saw me as a background extra in their grand production. But Rachel was my whole world, and I'd do anything to protect her, even if it meant stepping out of the shadows when the time came. For now, all I could do was wait, and hope that, when it mattered most, Rachel would remember who she really was. The weeks before the wedding blurred into a strange kind of limbo. Rachel and I talked less, not because we didn't want to, but because the Miles machine kept her busy from sunrise to midnight. Between the last-minute fittings, tastings, and a bachelorette weekend at some lake house I wasn't invited to, my daughter was swept along by a current that seemed impossible to fight. Every so often, I'd get a text. "Miss you, Dad. Can we talk soon?" But by the time I called back, she was at a florist or on her way to a cake tasting, her voice lost in a crowd of planners and opinions. My own house, which used to feel full of purpose, now felt too quiet. I kept busy with yard work, organizing old tools, even fixing up the Chevy's engine just for something to do. Sometimes I'd sit in Ellen's rocking chair on the porch, drinking coffee and wondering if all parents felt this helpless when their kids started new lives. The day before the wedding, the Miles family hosted a rehearsal dinner at the Riverbend Country Club, a place so fancy you could smell the money in the air. I wore my best suit, the one Ellen bought me for our last anniversary, and tried not to look out of place among the tailored jackets and silk dresses. Inside the ballroom, white linens covered every table, and tall vases of lilies and roses stood like sentinels in the center. Rachel sat beside Brandon at the head table, looking beautiful but tired, her smile stretched a little too tight. Linda and Charles were in their element, greeting guests with practiced charm, directing waitstaff, and ensuring every detail was perfect for tomorrow. I found my seat next to a couple from Florida, old friends of the Miles family. They introduced themselves, then quickly turned their attention to the wine list. I felt invisible, just another face in a crowd gathered to celebrate a union that was starting to feel less like a marriage and more like a business merger. During dinner, Brandon gave a short speech. He thanked his parents, toasted Rachel's amazing spirit, and threw in a few jokes about how she'd soon be living the high life. A ripple of laughter followed, but Rachel's cheeks flushed, and she stared down at her plate. After dessert, I wandered out to the patio for some fresh air. The sun was setting over the golf course, painting the sky in pink and gold. Rachel joined me a few minutes later, arms folded, rubbing her hands together against the evening chill. "Dad," she said quietly, "is it bad that I'm nervous?" "Nervous is normal, honey. Weddings are big, scary things, even when you're sure." She looked at me, eyes shining. "I don't know if I'm sure about all this. I keep thinking about Mom and how happy you two were, even when things were simple. I can't remember the last time something felt simple." I reached for her hand, rough from years of gardening, and squeezed it. "It's not about simple or fancy, Ratch. It's about whether the person next to you makes you feel seen. Whether you can be yourself, no matter what." She was quiet for a long time. "I wish you could walk me down the aisle tomorrow and we could just go home for pot roast afterward." I managed a smile. "We'll have our pot roast, sweetheart. No matter what happens tomorrow, you'll always have a place at my table." A few tears escaped, and she let herself lean into my shoulder. I wished I could freeze time right then and there, just me and my little girl against the world. Back inside, the Miles family was organizing a photo by the grand staircase. Charles called out, "Frank, come join us for a family picture." I hesitated, then stepped into place, forcing a smile as the photographer snapped away. For a moment, I caught Brandon's eye. His expression was one of polite triumph, as if he'd finally closed a difficult deal. As the guests began to leave, Brandon's friend Carter clapped me on the back. "Frank, you did good. Rachel's a real catch, she'll fit right in." I smiled thinly. "She's always been a catch, Carter. She doesn't need to fit into anything." As I left the club, I glanced back at the building, its windows blazing with light. I wondered what Ellen would say if she could see all this. Maybe she'd tell me to trust Rachel, or maybe she'd march right up to Brandon and set him straight. I wished, for the 100th time, that she was still here to share the load. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I replayed every conversation, every look, every moment when Rachel's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. In the dark, the house felt both safe and lonely, a museum of memories and a shelter from everything outside. Tomorrow, I would walk my daughter down the aisle. I prayed that when the music started and the doors opened, Rachel would feel her own strength, her own worth, no matter what name she took or what family she joined. And deep down, I made myself a promise: if anyone hurt her, if anyone treated her less than she deserved, no matter how rich or powerful, I wouldn't stay silent. Not this time. The morning of the wedding broke clear and warm, sunlight pouring through my curtains as if daring me to find hope in the day ahead. I rose before dawn, made coffee, and sat with Ellen's picture in the quiet kitchen. "You'd know what to say to her today," I whispered, tracing her smile with my thumb. I put on my suit, straightened my tie 3 times, and dug through the closet for the handkerchief Ellen had given me for luck all those years ago. The house was silent, but my heart was louder than ever. By 9, the world outside was already buzzing. Cars lined the street as neighbors prepared for another ordinary Saturday. But for me, nothing about this day felt ordinary. I climbed into the Chevy and drove to the church, every block bringing a new wave of nerves. St. Andrew's stood tall at the end of Main Street, its old brick walls decorated with white ribbons and overflowing bouquets. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and anticipation. Linda and Charles moved through the crowd, greeting guests with smiles that never touched their eyes. I waited in a side room with Rachel, who looked stunning in a dress as simple as she could get away with. "How do I look, Dad?" she asked, twirling nervously. "Like a miracle," I said honestly, and she smiled, a real, unguarded smile that sent a crack through my anxiety. She squeezed my hand. "Let's get this over with," she whispered, half joking, half hoping. I kissed her forehead, proud and terrified all at once. The music started. The doors opened. All heads turned as we walked down the aisle, Rachel's arm tight in mine. I felt the eyes on us, felt the whisper of expensive suits and designer heels, but all I saw was my daughter, walking into a future I couldn't predict. At the altar, Brandon stood tall and polished, smiling for the guests, radiating confidence. As I placed Rachel's hand in his, he leaned in and said quietly, "Thanks for everything, Frank. She'll be well taken care of now." For a split second, my jaw tightened. I looked him dead in the eye and replied, just as softly, "Take care of her heart, Brandon. That's worth more than anything you own." The ceremony blurred together, vows, rings, a kiss that made the crowd cheer. Rachel smiled for the camera, but I caught the flash of nerves in her eyes as the guests pressed close, eager to congratulate the newlyweds. At the reception, every detail screamed money. Waiters glided through the room with trays of champagne. The band played Sinatra, and the Miles family held court at the center table, receiving praise as if they'd orchestrated the whole town. As the evening wore on, I felt more like a prop than a father, standing in the background of photos, nodding politely at guests who barely remembered my name. Every so often, I'd catch Rachel's eye across the room. She smiled, but there was a distance in it, like she was watching the night from behind glass. Then came the moment I'd been dreading. Brandon, tipsy from too many toasts, stood and tapped his glass for attention. "Everyone, let's raise a glass to my beautiful wife, and to her dad, Frank, who did his best with what he had." The room chuckled, missing the sting behind his words. "But don't worry, Rachel, you'll never have to clip coupons again." The laughter rolled over me like a cold wave. For a second, I saw red, my hands balled into fists under the table. I glanced at Rachel, whose face had gone pale, her eyes darting to mine in apology. Brandon's mother, Linda, tried to smooth things over, quickly launching into a story about her own wedding. The guests relaxed, but I stayed quiet, the hurt burning under my skin. Later, while the dance floor was crowded, Margaret, Brandon's aunt, approached. "Frank, I hope you know we'll take good care of your girl. The Miles family always protects its own." I looked her in the eye. "Rachel's always been her own. And she's stronger than you think." Margaret blinked, taken aback, and retreated to her circle of friends. When it was time for the father-daughter dance, Rachel found me near the edge of the room. "You okay, Dad?" "I am now," I said, taking her hand as the band played a soft tune. We danced, slow and quiet, away from the noise. "I'm sorry about what Brandon said," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. "It's not your fault," I said. "But you don't have to let anyone define your worth, not him, not his family, not anyone." She pressed her face to my shoulder. "You're still my safe place, Dad. No matter what." That was all I needed to hear. For a few minutes, it was just us, father and daughter, holding on to something true in the middle of a world that sometimes forgot what mattered. As the night wound down, I slipped away from the ballroom and stepped outside. The air was cool, and the sky glittered with stars. I breathed deep, letting the fresh air clear my head. Inside, the party raged on, but I knew the real celebration would come later, when Rachel found her own voice, when she learned that happiness doesn't come from gold-plated centerpieces or champagne towers. It comes from being loved, really loved, for who you are. I promised myself, as I stood under the quiet Ohio sky, that I would always be there for her. And if she ever needed me, I'd come running, no matter how far she wandered from home. The wedding faded into memory like the last notes of a song. Rachel and Brandon set off for their honeymoon, the Miles family's limo sweeping them away in a flurry of rice and flashbulbs. The guests drifted home, tired and a little tipsy, the country club already being reset for its next event. I drove back to my quiet house alone, the city lights twinkling in the rearview mirror. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, sat in Ellen's old chair, and let the night settle around me. There was pride in my heart, pride for Rachel, who had faced the spotlight with more grace than I ever could have mustered. But worry lingered too, stubborn and heavy. A week later, the newlyweds returned to Cleveland, and the Miles machine cranked right back up. There were brunches, business meetings, and talk of house shopping in neighborhoods I couldn't even afford to visit. Rachel called sometimes, but her voice was always hurried. Brandon was in and out, always. On the way to a meeting. Always with an eye on his phone. I kept my distance, just as I had during the engagement, trying not to meddle. But one rainy Saturday, Rachel showed up at my door without warning. She was soaked, hair clinging to her cheeks, and when I pulled her inside she collapsed onto the couch and sobbed. "It's all just a show, Dad," she whispered. "I thought maybe I could change things, or that love would be enough, but I don't even recognize my life anymore. I feel small. I feel invisible." I made tea the way Ellen used to, adding honey and a little too much lemon. We sat in silence until Rachel caught her breath. "Brandon's different, Dad. He says things, mean things sometimes. He acts like he's rescuing me. Like I should be grateful." I took her hand, steady and strong. "You don't have to be grateful for anything you didn't ask for. And you never have to settle for being less than you are." She gave a shaky laugh. "You always know what to say." "That's just practice," I replied, smiling. "But Ratch, you've got more strength in you than you think. And you're not alone. Not now, not ever." It was around that time the rumors started floating through town. People talked about the Miles family, about business deals that had gone sour, about the way Brandon was behaving at work. One afternoon, I stopped at the old coffee shop downtown and ran into an old friend, Jim Harper, who'd worked in banking since before I ran my factory. "Frank, you hear about Brandon Miles?" Jim asked, voice low. "Can't say I have." "Should I?" Jim leaned in. "He's been reckless. Spending too much, mouthing off to clients. There's talk that Charles Miles is worried about the future of the company. Some say he's looking for new leadership." I didn't show my surprise. Brandon's always been ambitious. Maybe a little too sure of himself. Jim nodded. "Ambition's fine. Arrogance, that's trouble." I went home and mulled over what I'd heard. All the Miles money in the world couldn't fix the simple truth that respect had to be earned, not inherited. Then, one Friday evening, the Miles family invited me to a charity gala at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I almost didn't go, but Rachel asked me herself, saying, "It would mean a lot if you were there, Dad. Please." So I pulled out my best jacket, the one that still held a hint of Ellen's perfume, and drove downtown. The gala was a parade of wealth, champagne, designer gowns, politicians shaking hands with businessmen who owned half the city. Brandon was holding court with his parents, but as soon as I arrived, he spotted me and, maybe emboldened by a few drinks, introduced me to his circle. "Gentlemen, this is my father-in-law, Frank Walker. Salt of the earth, worked his way up from nothing. The kind of guy you read about in old stories." He laughed, and a few of the men snickered politely. I smiled, but inside, I felt that familiar sting. "That's right, Brandon. Built everything from scratch. Sometimes the old ways work best." Just then, someone new joined the group, a woman in an elegant suit. She shook Brandon's hand, but when she saw me, her eyes widened. Mr. Walker? Are you the same Frank Walker who invested in the Millstone project 10 years ago? Brandon's smile faltered. Wait, you're not talking about the manufacturing deal in Dayton, are you? She nodded. He saved dozens of jobs, revitalized a dying town. Didn't you know your father-in-law's reputation in the business community? The room grew quiet as several guests turned to listen. I shrugged modestly. Just did what needed doing. Didn't see much point in talking about it. Brandon stared, mouth open. You never said? I shook my head, gentle but firm. I never needed to. My life isn't a show, Brandon. It's about how you treat people when no one's looking. Something changed in the room. People began introducing themselves to me, asking for advice, thanking me for past kindnesses. The Miles family watched as their status shifted. Brandon's bravado faded. For the first time, I saw a flicker of humility in his eyes. Later that night, as I was leaving, Rachel found me by the door. I had no idea, Dad. Why didn't you tell me? I hugged her close. Because who I am doesn't change who you are, Ratch. You never needed my money to be special. You've always been enough. She started to cry, but this time the tears were relief. After that, something shifted. Rachel found her voice. She started teaching again, insisted on a home that was truly hers, and let Brandon know that her heart couldn't be bought. Their marriage wouldn't be easy, but it would be real. And I knew, deep down, she would never be invisible again. As for me, I found peace in the slow rhythms of my life. Coffee on the porch, walks through the garden, visits from Rachel when she wanted advice or just to hear an old story. I missed Ellen every day, but I knew she'd be proud. Sometimes, justice doesn't come all at once. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, one truth, one act of kindness, one stand for dignity at a time. And as I sat on my porch in the fading light, I realized I wasn't just telling the story of a wedding. I was telling the story of a family learning what matters most: love, respect, and the courage to never let anyone define your worth but yourself.